We live in a college football world where making the college football playoff from a conference standpoint is the end all be all. And it makes a lot of sense. Like it with the just sheer amount of money, fame, acclaim, notoriety that comes with making the college football playoff. And there's up to this year 5 power conferences for 4 spots. It makes all the sense in the world that conferences have prioritized we need to put teams in the college football playoff. But not all conferences are made equally. And I think people forget and lose sight of that at times because the idea that a conference like there have been arguments that the 4 slots should be reserved for conference champions, or that an 8-team playoff is best and you get automatic bids for winning your conference championship game. I don't like that one bit because I don't think it prioritizes the regular season. I don't think it prioritizes getting the best teams in the playoff. If Iowa was to beat Michigan on Saturday, does that mean Iowa deserves to be one of the 4 best teams, 4 only teams eligible to win a college national championship? No, because they're not. They win one arbitrary game. I think sucks. Should Louisville be in the college football playoff if they beat Florida State? No, they shouldn't. Should Washington and Oregon? Yeah, they should, because they've got a complete body of work over the course of 12 games that shows like, hey, we're one of the best teams in America. And every once in a while you get, like a few years ago, Ohio State played 8-5 Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game. Should Northwestern be one of 4 teams possible to win a college national championship? No, because you didn't prove it over the course of 12, or in their case, 13 games. It doesn't make any sense. So not every conference is created equal. Not every conference championship game is created equal. And we lose sight of that sometimes. But there's one scheduling trick that the SEC has done and used and utilized in their favor time and time again to have an upper hand in getting teams into the college football playoff. And it's simply that they play one less conference game than everybody else. The strength of schedule argument is frequently used by the SEC. We have a great strength of schedule, and their strength of schedule isn't any better than anybody else's, but their strength of record is better than other conferences. But in the same vein that every conference isn't created equally and every conference championship game isn't created equally, every conference schedule isn't created equally either. Big Ten plays 9 conference games. Big 12, 9 conference games. Pac-12, 9 conference games. SEC, 8 conference games. And what you do when you play 8 conference games instead of 9 conference games is you ensure that you have 7 fewer losses for the most part than every other conference. The teams in your league will have 7 fewer losses in total because they're not playing mano-a-mano, and one of them has to lose. So instead of, for instance, Alabama playing Georgia in the regular season, Alabama plays UT Chattanooga. Georgia plays a bad non-conference opponent. They both tally wins. They both end up having a better record than Ohio State and Penn State, who had to play one another. Like, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, especially when you haven't been dinged for not playing a 9-game conference schedule. When you say, hey, we're going to open the season, like Georgia's non-conference schedule this year is UT Martin, Ball State, UAB, and Georgia Tech. Now, I will die on this hill. I'm never gonna say that, like Georgia plays Georgia Tech every year, Florida plays Florida State every year, Clemson, South Carolina, like Kentucky, Louisville. There are matchups that should play every year, and that I'm not going to ding you in your non-conference that, the last week of the season that Georgia's going to play Georgia Tech or Alabama is going to play Auburn. They're just, and then in the non-conference games, Clemson, South Carolina, Kentucky, Louisville, etc., where you get those SEC versus ACC matchups. I'm never going to complain about that being your scheduling intent. But when your fourth non-conference game for this year for Georgia, and there's no way to say who would really be there rotating, but in their what would be their ninth conference game, they don't play LSU, they don't play Alabama, they don't play Texas A&M. They play everybody in the SEC East, but they're not playing Mississippi State, which probably isn't going to beat Georgia. But you know what? They're probably going to put up a better fight than UT Martin or Ball State or UAB. So when you get that extra opportunity to compile wins and you get the extra opportunity to not add a loss or in some cases 7 losses to your conference every year, because you know what? If Ohio State or Michigan, if Michigan this year only had to play 8 games instead of 9 conference games, the teams from the West that they played are at Nebraska, at Minnesota, Purdue. Okay, so instead of at Nebraska or at Minnesota, they play UAB. It's a lot better at Penn State this year. If Penn State doesn't have to play Minnesota, if Penn State doesn't have to play Nebraska, Penn State's losses both come to Big Ten East schools, but their other division schools are Illinois, Iowa, Northwestern. You end up playing Ball State instead. You don't end up tallying a loss. So your teams look better in the top 25 because instead of being 9-3, they're 10-2, or instead of being 8-4, they're 9-3. You add extra wins to your schedule by operating the way the SEC does, and they haven't been penalized for it. And I don't know that they deserve to be penalized for it. But if the College Football Playoff Committee is never going to say and never going to honor, like, hey, this school played 9 conference games and scheduled another out of conference game against a Power 5 school. They played 10 Power 5 opponents and you played 8. Until they do that, it's never going to be an incentive for the SEC to move their scheduling model. So it's a win-win-win-win-win for the SEC. And to their credit, like, hey, congratulations, you've gamed the system and it hasn't cost you. And I don't see a scenario where it really does cost them, because if you are getting to the point where you're saying, okay, we've got somebody from the Big 10 or the Big 12 who played 9 conference games and then scheduled an out-of-conference game against another Power 5 opponent, they've got 10, while this SEC school only has 8, you're already splitting hairs. And the SEC's earned the benefit of the doubt, right? Like over the course of the last, 17 years, they've earned that benefit of the doubt that when in doubt, pick the team from that conference and you're likely to be right. So I don't see this changing anytime soon. Whether it should or not is probably a different discussion. Should everybody be on the same kind of schedule template? Yeah. Should there be 9 conference games across the board? I don't know if it should be 9 or 8, but everybody should be playing on the same field. If you want to say everybody should play 9 conference games and then another non-conference game against a Power 5 school, I think, one, it does a boatload of wonder for it. All it does is benefit college football, because you're going to get at least better / more interesting, more intriguing matchups. If you're a casual fan or you're not a Georgia fan, are you going to watch Georgia UT Martin? No. But will you watch Georgia Kansas State? Probably. Or will that be more interesting than Georgia UT Martin? Now, I don't think by the NCAA or the College Football Playoff Committee saying, hey, we want to see you play 10 Power 5 conference teams every year. I don't expect everybody to, I don't expect you're going to get a Notre Dame versus Texas and a Georgia versus Oklahoma, or Georgia versus Ohio State and Michigan versus Oklahoma every year. I think there are going to be a lot of schools that are rushing to play Indiana and Iowa State. But if you're going to say we're going to rank teams based on resume, but then everybody's got unequal resumes where this team has played 9 conference games. This team has played 8 conference games, but this team played somebody tough out of somebody difficult in non-conference, or went on the road in the non-conference to a Power 5 school or whatever. If you can get to, and they make schedules so far in advance that you're never going to be able to get everybody on the same schedule of like, hey, our expectation, and even if they said our expectation is for you to play 9 Power 5 opponents. Georgia and Alabama and they all, for the most part, do it because they've got a rivalry outside of the conference that, Georgia does it, Clemson does it, Alabama does it, Kentucky does it, where you've got somebody you're playing every year that it makes sense to like, okay, you're playing 9 conference games, or I guess at least 9 Power 5 games. But not everybody's on that same template. And so it's an uneven resume year after year after year. But it's the one thing that nobody ever really looks at. Nobody says, and as people make cases for themselves going into the selection show on Sunday, nobody's going to say, well, we played 10 Power 5 conference games and they only played 9. It just doesn't come up because at the end of the day, we have, and I don't think this is a bad thing, we have just strictly prioritized record. What is your record? Florida State's likely to finish 13-0. Is Florida State's 13-0 better than Alabama's 12-1? I have no idea. But if you're looking at, and it's a nice thing that the flawed and the super flawed system of going to 4 teams is going away, because it's difficult to just pick the top 4. There have been years where there shouldn't have been 4. This year, I think you can make the argument that any of 8 teams in the country could win the national championship. So the fact that it's only 4 this year sucks. The fact that it has been more than 2 some years has stunk because none of those 3 and 4 didn't have a chance. And that's just part of the ebbs and flows of college football. So you're doing away with a really flawed system, but it's inherently flawed. And I think we're going to look back on this time in the 4-team playoff and be like, man, how different are those results if there's a 12-team playoff in those years instead of a 4-team playoff? Now you can just play the what if game. That's easier said than done. But I think when you have the stakes as high as they are and have been in a 4-team playoff, I think it's outrageous and crazy for every conference outside of the SEC to make their schedule and their path to those 4 slots more difficult. Now, I enjoy, Big Ten rivalries is it, but playing teams in the Big Ten or playing teams in the Pac-12 or the Big 12 more frequently. It's outrageous to me that like Georgia's going to play Texas A&M in 2027 for the first time at home since they've been in the same conference for 15 years. Like, that's outrageous to me. But you can't argue with what the results bore out. You can't say, that was a detriment to the SEC. They've gotten a team or 2 teams in every year. Nobody else can say that. And whether or not it's due to one scheduling decision or not is neither here nor there. But it certainly doesn't hurt that they only play 8 conference games. And basically told ESPN, like, we would be willing to move to 9 conference games if you're going to pony up that much more money. But if you're not, sorry, we'll see you. And keep playing 8 conference games. And really, in a 12-team playoff, you don't have any extra incentive to now move to a 9 games conference schedule, because there are going to be teams that get in it, depending on the year. There's going to be some years a 9-3 team is going to make the college football playoff in a 10-team playoff, 12-team playoff. It's just going to happen. So why saddle one of your not A-tier elite members, but you're certainly B-plus tier members with a potential extra loss? Strength of schedule and strength of record is all we do is prioritize record. All we care about is, because it's a simple measure, it's a simple metric. How many wins you got versus how many losses you got. Because anytime you dive past that, everything else is argumentative. Everything else is objective. You have to, or subjective. Everything else is you have to take it with a grain of salt, or you can argue one way or another. But when you just look at the numbers and go, well, this team won 13 games, it's really simple. So it's not going to get any better anytime soon. And you can take pride in the fact, like, it's one of those things that the conferences outside of the SEC beat their chests about. It's like, well, we played an extra conference game. Whoop-de-doo. Like, if that doesn't reward you by giving your teams a more likely chance to compete for a national title, but two, an easier chance to play for the national title, who cares? And you can beat your chest all you'd like about, like, hey, we played 9 conference games compared to 8 to those Southerners. That's great. But they're still winning all the national championships. And I don't, believe me, I'm not saying that if the Big 12 goes down to 8 conference games, that suddenly, Oklahoma State is now a juggernaut or anything like that. But they lose a loss, probably. Kansas State loses a loss, potentially. And when that's all that matters, you should prioritize it as if that's all that matters. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching here on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. If you are listening on the podcast, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping us get in front of more college football fans, and that's always a good thing. We'll be back at it tomorrow. I'll see you right here on the Daily Huddle from Saturday Glory.